I'm speaking this afternoon with Yuriy Andrukhovych, one of Ukraine's most important writers. He is a novelist, a poet, an essayist, widely translated throughout the world, and he's speaking to us from Ivano-Frankivsk. Yuriy, welcome.
Thank you very much, Askold, for your invitation, and good evening from Ivano-Frankivsk.
Yuriy, you and I met in 1990. You had just published your first book. It was a series of stories based on your experiences in the Afghan war, as I remember. I wonder if you could just say a few words about the beginning of your literary career.
I started writing poetry by my 16, 17, and I was then at a school, and so it was my secret thing that I do something what is quite unusual. I write poems, so I didn't want to show them to some other person until I absolved my school and I started studying in Lviv. It was a printing institute, and I studied journalism there, and I met some other students who wrote the poems too. So I decided, now it's the moment I can show them what I write. And it was a good start because they liked my poems, so I was somehow encouraged to do it further. And then I met a very important person for my writer's career, Askold Melnyczuk. He was then 28 or 29 years old, and he was already a very famous literary observer, literary critic. And he liked my poems very much, and he was somebody who persuaded me to publish them, because I was very skeptical about the possibilities to publish my poems in then Soviet periodics. I didn't want to go to some literary magazine, to some newspaper to propose my poems for some publication. But Mykola organized a few of publications for me, and he persuaded me it's not impossible to publish some poems which are not Soviet, not ideological ones. So it was my first experience to see my own texts published in some literary magazine called Żółty. It was then the name of in 1982 my first publication, and it was the name of this magazine because it was renamed in the later years, and it became Dzin.
Oh, right.
Was the later name of this Żółty. Right. And so, as I had to go to military service to the Red Army, it was a year later after this my first publication. I had this small privilege. I would say my inner privilege. It was just my inner, so to speak, knowledge that I'm somebody who writes poems. I'm not just one of the soldiers here.
Mm-hmm.
I have this kind of secret, of my personal secret. I was in the army 1.5 years. Then, as I was back, Mykola helped a lot with my first collection of poems, and it has been published in 1985.
Mm.
So after this moment, I can say since 1985, I'm somehow professional in literature, because I got my first collection of poems, which was quite successful. It got very good reviews and articles. My name could be seen among the other names of poets of our generation. It was a time as the notion came вісімдесятники, so the generation of poets from 80s. It was a time of our debuts. And the second, or maybe the very first important circumstance, in the same year, 85, we, with my friends, Oleksandr and Victor Neborak, we grounded our poetic performance group, which we called Bubabu.
What does Bubabu stand for?
Yeah, Bubabu, Burlesque Palagan Bufonada.
As I recall, there was a famous performance called Chrysler Imperial.
Yes, it is. I would say it is the period of high bubabismus, blossoming bubabismus, because we should speak about much later times. The censorship, which was very strong, and I would say which was decisive at the time as we started in 85. And on the beginning of our time, of our bubabism, there was no possibility to openly to publish some of our poems in some official media. But 92, it is absolutely different situation. You can do what you want. There is absolute freedom of speech, and there is an absolute freedom of self-realization and of some for each artistic ambition, for each artistic ability.
Mm-hmm.
And it was actually, I would say, it was more pluralistic and more tolerant than even today.
Really?
Yes, we have more conservative situation now.
Why?
I don't mean the war situation now, but I would say we have more conservatism concerning the culture and literature in our time, comparing to the beginning of new Ukrainian state. So I mean the beginning of 90s.
Do you think of this as the kind of natural systole diastole movement back and forth that happens traditionally? Because, you know, for instance, you will have the Dadaists and the Surrealists, and then you have a return to more conventional literary modes.
Yes, absolutely. This is the same. This is analogy, I would say, not the same, because there is no two different cultural situations which are the same.
Right.
But it is a kind of analogy. I call all the time, so I mean the end of 80s and the beginning of 90s. I call the time a very special time in Ukraine as a festival age.
Yes.
So the festival age could be characterized by as a huge social political break, but it is also, of course, the break in mentality, the break in the consciousness, and it was kind of apogee.
Yes, apogee.
Apogee of openness to everything, and it is slowly ending till the middle of 90s. I think it has also some political reasons, because since 94, 95, there is the beginning of oligarchization of Ukraine.
Mm.
So the big money comes into action. It is the money of big oligarchs, and they, so to speak, they order the menus for cultural events. But it was the golden time was so maybe it begins in 80, 87, 88, and it ends 93, 94. And then we have this period of dominating of Russian culture, pop culture, Russian pop culture, Rossiyska popsa, TV series from Russia, Russian pop music everywhere. And you know, this agenda has been a little bit stopped just by Orange Revolution in 2004.
Was it, I mean, again, that was because, as I understand it, the decisions about kind of culture, publication, and finance were flowing out of Moscow rather than locally. And were the oligarchs who were becoming the guardians of culture, were they primarily in Russia, or were they also in Ukraine?
No, I mean now our Ukrainian oligarchs, but their cultural identity is completely Russian.
Right.
So they just made their money in Ukraine, but they ordered for Ukrainian cultural space. They ordered Russian culture. And of course, it wasn't the kind of innovative, of ambitious culture. It was just this on the level of the pop star. And the Orange Revolution was the first stage of resistance. In that meaning, the Orange Revolution is for me, first of all, a huge cultural event, and it is a huge carnival. You can say it is the last revolution in the Eastern Europe from the period of 89. Then we had a kind of cultural struggle, but after the second Maidan, after 2014, we have something like a huge comeback of patriotic seriousness. That's why that's probably why I mentioned this event, that we have more conservatism and less carnivalism in our cultural discourse now.
Well, you probably can't sustain that energy. That energy is also associated with youth, isn't it? It is the energy of beginnings, the energy of young people.
Yeah. Yes,
and
of course.
who are the writers in the generation before yours who you found influential and who showed the way forward, if there were any?
If we speak about poets, I can mention the dozens of names, and some of them were absolutely official. They were normally published in the Soviet time, like Dmytro Pavlichko, Ivan Drach, Mykola Vengranovsky. Some of them, like Lina Kostenko, who was my favorite actually, as I was a youngster. Some of them, like Lina Kostenko, they had problems with publishing, but it was just periodically.
On what grounds? Why would she have had trouble?
Yes, because she wrote in unconventional way, in the Soviet meaning. She didn't write about Communist Party, about Lenin, and her attitude to the language, culture, being Ukrainian, was always quite inappropriate to the Soviet system. It was like a kind of heresy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I mentioned four figures, but of course there was a large community of underground poets, and they were most influential for us, for our generation. They were the ones who also created some ethical pattern.
Oh.
The poets like Igor Kalinets, or Mykola Vorobyov, Vasil Goloborodko. So some of them belonged to the so-called Kiev school of poets, and Igor Kalinets from Lviv. So actually we had, I mean our generation, or maybe more concrete, I mean our group, we Bubavists, we had a lot of Ukrainian poets who were, so to speak, great authorities for us. And now I will mention Hrytsko Chubai, who was just a hero for us. Those who have been mentioned before, they were of course very high respected poets, but Hrytsko Chubai was the only one who was the real hero.
Why?
For his time, it was absolutely new poetic language, what he has cultivated. His experimental poetry was could be written in Poland, could be written in France, could be written in Spain, or maybe in the United States. It was a kind of contemporary voice, which is universal.
Right, not constrained by the sort of social demands and expectations.
Yes, it was always readable there.
Yeah,
but it was made in a way like it was made in a universal way.
Yeah. So, were the other writers that you mentioned who were not the official sort of writers in Kyiv, but were a little bit more underground, were their publications published by in samizdats, or were there other presses who were publishing them?
Yes. First of all, I met the poems. I didn't meet themselves, but the poems written by them were in samizdat, or if you prefer Ukrainian word samvidav,
Mm-hmm.
just typed
Underground.
on the typewriter. And the big expert and big collector
Yeah, collector.
Collector of all that underground poetry was Mykola Revchuk.
Oh. So
in his house in Lviv, I was quite often as a guest there. I always got some stuff with typewritings, and he should be then as some of the best experts in what Ukrainian underground literature of that time is. So he could collected some anthologies, and he had everything in his house. And he also had a lot of books which were partly prohibited or just took out from libraries from different ideological reasons. And his library, his private library, was absolutely huge. So his refrigerator, if you can imagine, was full of books.
Wow.
And manuscripts.
Wow, I love it.
There was never some food in his flat, but refrigerator was full of the books. So I got my first informations about those people.
Mm-hmm.
I heard for the first time the name Kochubai in his flat, in Mykola's flat, and then then we had the situation in the second half of 80s. Some of those poets have been officially published. So they the first poetry books by Vasyl Goloborodko, Mykola Vorobyov, Viktor Kordun. It was always a kind of sensation because they were legendary poets, legendary men who did some revolution in Ukrainian poetry, but now you can just go to the bookstore and buy it absolutely officially and openly. And it was, of course, a great experience.
And yes, was this the case across the country, or was this more in Lviv? Because I remember when I was in Kyiv for the first time in 1990, it was still difficult to find Ukrainian books in bookstores.
Yeah.
Kyiv, anyway.
But maybe you remember there was the only bookstore, and the name of this bookstore was Poezia in Kyiv. It is Maidan Nezalezhnosti today. But I think this bookstore has been closed in the middle of 90s, exactly the time of oligarchization. But in the second half of 80s, it was the place where you actually could buy each new Ukrainian poetry book, and a very new phenomenon of that time, the readings,
Right.
the performances made by poets
Yeah.
since 1987, I think. I think it was the very first live presentation at that bookstore was by four our friends from our generation, four poets coming from this group of metaphorists. And they were Vasil Harasuniuk, Igor Remaruk, Ivan Malkovich, and somebody else, maybe Igor Malenki or some of them. So it was the very first reading, and it turned out to be a quite popular thing, because to this very first reading, maybe 200 people came, and it was, of course, absolutely full of people, and it was sensation. So you could observe then this changing in mentality, and there is somebody which is getting closer, some new quality of social role of the poet.
One of the things I think that we here in the United States are always very impressed by, and also awed and puzzled by, is the popularity of poetry readings. I don't know if they continue to be as popular as they were then, but I remember attending some of those readings in those early days, and they were huge events, as you say, 200 people, more people than that. How do you explain the popularity of poetry, which is here considered a very private art and pretty exclusive, whereas in Ukraine, in my experience, it has been very widely embraced by a much bigger population?
We were moving in the direction of this very private events, like everywhere in normal countries, in Western countries, I mean. But you always have some explosions of some manifestations of boom, poetic boom. You still have it in Ukraine, but you have to work on that. You have to do some big campaign to invite the people. You have to join some stars, some poetic stars, musical stars. You have to connect it to some big event, to some festival, like, for example, a huge book fair in Kiev.
Sure,
Knyzhkovy Arsenal.
Sure.
And then you have there some poetic stage where you can listen to the poetry whole day, non-stop. And you see there are some 3 or 5 persons to some which come to a certain event, but to the next event there are 300 persons. So it's now what we have is a kind of diversity.
Also, your work as a novelist is widely recognized and celebrated. So
yeah, it was maybe because I reached a certain age. I had a superstition in my youth that one cannot be still a poet after he is 30. And so I I was 30 in 1990. Actually, as we met with you in Kiev, I wrote at that time my very last poems before the long pause. Actually, after our meeting in Kiev at the festival Zolotый Homin, I went back to Moscow because I've been studying there in that time, and I started writing my first novel, which was actually one of the main results of my participation at our festival. And Recreation is the title, right, as you know.
Yes.
And it is a very short novel, which I could manage to write it, during 2 weeks, something like this.
Wow!
But it was a huge joy to write it. I was like all the time flying on my upon my
inspiration
desktop.
On your inspiration.
Yeah, and what I experienced then, it was the prose is as fascinating as the poetry.
So let's fast forward over the decades. You mentioned earlier the importance of Maidan in reigniting a sense of national urgency. And it seems to me that where we are today is directly related to that period. The kinds of the war really in some ways began with Maidan. And I wonder if there's something that you could tell us about the tension that must have existed in the country that exploded in Maidan, and the kind of sort of social transformation that we all witnessed here in the kind of heightened national awareness of people insisting independence and freedom. That seems like a radical transformation from the earlier Soviet period where people were willing to go along with things.
The Orange Revolution again, because it was the breaking experience for Ukrainian society. It was something completely new that a typical post-Soviet society turned out to be much more complicated. Striving to be free, to live in a democratic country, and to have the possibility to join the Western democratic world. Mm-hmm. So it was the first successful experience in our newest history. Mm-hmm. And nearly 10 years later, on the second Maidan, we had a much harder situation with a lot of blood, with death of protesters, huge violence from the side of the regime. But we won for the second time, even in that situation. So it was, it was what is always typical for Ukraine. Ukraine is surprising, give own life for that idea of Ukraine in Europe. Ukraine belongs to Europe. And it wasn't an abstract idea, because nobody will die for some abstract. It's just because Ukrainians are Ukrainians. They want to be free, and they want to decide about themselves. And it's a very detail that We have 30 years of independence, and we have already the 6th president of the country. You can compare it with the other post-Soviet countries, and you always see just kind of dictatorships there.
Mhm.
But Ukrainians don't want to tolerate any dictatorship, any authoritarianism. And so it's something, this democracy is a very important part of Ukrainian identity.
Mm.
It has the very deep historical roots, but I'm not historian. I cannot do some lecture about it. But the war we have now is the next stage of this process, because in each of these cases there is one and the same person behind. I mean the Russian president, who always tries to break Ukraine. He always tries to annihilate us, to conquer us, and he didn't understand by now that this is the country where he is always beaten. He's always defeated here. He should avoid Ukraine in any way, to be as far as he can from Ukraine. But he didn't understand it by now. That's why Ukraine is now the country which means also his end, his political end and his physical end, I hope very much. And so it was, of course, very unjust.
Yes.
That Ukraine was very underrated. And you mentioned this evaluations that in case of this war, it is the question of a few hours or maximally a few days, and then there will be no Ukraine anymore. But today is the 51st day and of the war, and Ukrainians are really successful in their resistance. And I hope that this is again, it will be a very, very tragical, it will be very hard story, but with a happy end.
Absolutely. Could you just tell us how your own life has changed?
My profession now is being public person. And sometimes I have to do it on the same time in 3 or 4 languages. Yeah. So it demands on special concentration.
Sure.
And my writing demands on its special concentration. Sure. Because I always was trying to reach my own highest level of stylistics. It is not the time I can elaborate each of my phrases and sentences to find my final perfectness in that. So I hope very much that I will be able to be back to my next book, which I have just started. I finished the first chapter of that novel 2 weeks before the war. Mm-hmm. I was expecting this invasion.
You were
since November. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. But so that's why I tried to write to start my next book with an idea. It could be a novel, but it also can be as a collection of the short stories. So the very first of short stories is already finished.
Так само я працював над повістю і нічого тепер не можу сконцентруватися, що тепер є тільки publicity і публіцистика. So, дякую, що ти з Новасор знайшов час ще далі бути таким public persona, public intellectual. Але, знаєш, хвилина тепер то від всіх вимагає. І сподіваюся, що цей час скоро закінчиться, і мир вернеться, і Україна всіх переможе, і з цього часу почнеться новий етап в Україні, і у світ, і в пошані, який світ буде показувати Україні і українській культурі.
Так. Я дуже цього сподіваюся, так. Я хотів би, щоб так було. За щось вже ці люди гинуть, за щось ця кров і ці злочини, це щось мусить, космос мусить якось це вибалансовувати.
Так.